Let's look at the case of market inefficiency created by a price ceiling. So we start out with our supply and our demand curve, remembering that supply is our marginal cost curve and demand is our marginal benefit curve. Our equilibrium point is where our supply and demand curve intersect and where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. We know that the equilibrium price is going to be located at equilibrium. So in this case, we are going to be looking at one-bedroom apartments in El Paso. The equilibrium price for those one-bedroom apartments is $775, and about 6,000 units are rented. Let's assume that the citizens of El Paso decide that this equilibrium price is too high, and they go to City Hall to petition for a price cap, or what is called a rent ceiling, and that would be a price ceiling, and they are successful. They are successful in a $400 a month price ceiling. This means that landlords cannot raise their rents above $400. On the surface, that looks really good because $400 a month is a great rental price. If you're the demander, right, if you're the one who has to rent the apartment, that's great. However, if you're the landlord, $400 a month is not so great because maybe, as a landlord, you're paying your mortgage, you're paying insurance, you pay maintenance, and perhaps $400 doesn't cover all the costs associated with your apartment complex. So first off, let's take a look at what happens. Now, we already know that the triangle above the equilibrium is consumer surplus, and the triangle below equilibrium is producer surplus. Okay, so that's something that we already know. We already know that a price ceiling will create a shortage. Why? Because at a price ceiling of $400, we're going to have 9,000 people out in the market looking for apartments. That's the demand curve. Now, at $400, only 3,000 apartment units are going to be supplied into the market. Again, why? Because the landlords can't cover their costs at this low price. So this creates a shortage. So the first inefficiency created by a price ceiling is what we call a shortage. Okay. Then we also have a reduction in producer and consumer surplus. So again, these are our triangles for consumer surplus, and this is our triangle for producer surplus. When we put in a price ceiling, the following happens. And I'm just going to draw in these blue lines a little bit darker. So 3,000 units are what the market or what suppliers are willing to supply when the price is $400. 3,000 units are valued at a price of $1,000. So that means the first 3,000 units that demanders are willing to rent, they're willing to pay $1,000. Okay, but sellers are only willing to supply 3,000 units into the market. Okay, so look what happens to consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is now reduced. It is no longer this giant triangle. Okay, this triangle disappears, and now consumer surplus is only the small triangle on top. So that gets reduced to just this triangle. So our consumer surplus is going to be reduced. With respect to producer surplus, the same thing happens. Our producer surplus is reduced. So now they no longer get this giant triangle of extra value or profit. Their producer surplus is reduced as well. To this very small triangle. right here. Okay. So price ceiling is going to reduce both consumer and producer surplus. It's going to reduce that value that both parties get. The third thing that a price ceiling is going to cause is what we call a deadweight loss. Okay. So the deadweight loss is going to occur because there are going to be people out there, these people who under an equilibrium price could have rented an apartment, no longer have access to an apartment because there aren't enough. Okay. And the suppliers who would have been willing to put more apartments into the market don't do that. They have resources that need to be deployed somewhere else where they can actually recover their cost. So this entire triangle here, okay, is a deadweight loss. So basically, these are resources that are lost. They're not available to us anymore. Then finally, a price ceiling is going to create a black market. Okay, so the black market is going to occur in this range right here, in this rectangle that we have. Why is that? Well, you can see at 3,000 units, there are some people who are willing to pay $1,000 for these apartments. Okay. So even though it might be illegal to charge over $400, the landlords might say, well, if there's somebody out there willing to pay $1,000 for an apartment, or somebody out there willing to pay a little bit more for an apartment, what I can do is charge maybe a key fee or a move-in fee, or maybe charge a little bit more under the table so that consumers will rent my apartment, because after all, there are people out there who are willing to pay more. Okay, so black markets will transfer some of the consumer surplus back to the producer. So in that sense, black markets are created. This is the illegal range of pricing, okay? But producers can figure out a way to price a little bit higher and therefore bring in that revenue. Conversely, there are people out there, so that would be the case of black markets, okay? So that transfers, a black market is going to transfer consumer surplus to the producer. There's also a situation where the consumers are benefiting. The ones who are benefiting are these first 3,000 apartment rentals where people are willing and able to pay more than the equilibrium price, but they don't have to. So then they also get some of the producer surplus transferred to them. And their producer surplus, or rather their consumer surplus, actually increases. So a ceiling of any type is going to have these four impacts and actually create a distortion in the market where we will not be achieving maximum efficiency that is found when we price where marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. All right, let's take a look at how we would analyze a price ceiling in the apartment rental market. Now, it's important to note that price ceilings occur across all types of products. During the pandemic, we had price ceilings on toilet paper. There are several countries that have price ceilings on products such as bread, such as milk. So the impacts of these do create shortages and black markets, as we've discussed. So let's go through the graph, and I want to show you how you would start to analyze this, especially if you have some of this in your homework problems. The question is, what is the rent and how many units will be rented? What is consumer surplus and producer surplus? So this is the first approach that you're going to take. Okay, so we know that this is the equilibrium price, And if we look at the equilibrium price, we can see that the equilibrium price for apartments is $800, and there are 3,000 units being rented at that price. The second question asks us, what is producer surplus and what is consumer surplus? So now we have to find the value of consumer surplus and producer surplus. In other words, what extra value are both renters of apartments and landlords getting at this market price that is established between buyers and sellers? So remember that consumer surplus is the triangle underneath the demand curve and above the market price. So we're going to find consumer surplus here. And then we're going to find producer surplus, which is the triangle above the supply curve and below the market price. So let's start with finding the consumer surplus amount. All right, consumer surplus. We are going to take this triangle and figure out the area. Recall that the area for a triangle is calculated as 1/2 base times the height. So the base of this triangle goes from 0 all the way to 3,000. Okay, but of course this is up a little bit higher, so from 0, so this means 0, all the way to 3,000. Okay, so the base is equal to 3,000. The height is from 1,200 to 800. Okay, so 1,200 minus 800 gives us 400. Okay, so the height, 1,200 minus 800, okay, we know that's going to give us 400. We're going to take all of this and divide it by 2. When we do that, we divide it by 2 because this is like half a box, so it's a triangle. We're going to divide that by 2. We find that the consumer surplus is $600,000. Okay? There is $600,000 of extra value that apartment renters get because they don't have to rent at the price that they're able to rent at. They get to rent at the equilibrium price. Okay, so consumer surplus is $600,000. So let's just jot that down. I'm going to put that beneath the graph so we can keep track of these things. So consumer surplus equal to $600,000. Okay, when marginal benefit equals marginal cost and we are at equilibrium, right? Okay, now the question asks us to find producer surplus. Well, how do we find that? Well, we're going to take the same process. We are going to find the area of the triangle that constitutes producer surplus. So, please write this down in your notes. You are responsible for knowing how to do this. Okay, so now we're going to calculate producer surplus, and we're going to go from the base of this triangle, and this goes from 0 all the way to 3,000. Okay, so the base is going to be equal to 3,000. And the height of the triangle is from 800 to 600. So we're going to take 800 minus 600, and that's going to give us this distance. Okay. And we're going to divide it all by 2. So 3,000 times 800 minus 600, that gives us 200. And we divide all of this by 2, will give us 300,000. So this becomes the producer surplus. Okay. Again, when marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Our next question asks us, what is the impact of a rent ceiling of $900? Well, let's draw that in. We know that the equilibrium price is $800. So if we put a rent ceiling of $900, meaning that price cannot go over $900, does it have an impact? And the answer is no, because this is over the equilibrium price. Okay, so a ceiling to be impactful has to be under the equilibrium price. Okay, finally, or not finally, but the question number 3 is, what is the impact of a ceiling of $700? Okay, so again, why would they put in a rent ceiling of $700? Most of this is done for political reasons because people are complaining that the prices are too high. Government wants to take action and make it more fair and make sure people who can't afford the higher rents have those rents. And let's see what happens when they do put in that rent ceiling. So here we go, $700. Okay, now you are asked, what is the impact of a rent ceiling of $700? How many apartments are rented? So demanders at $700, we want to hit the demand curve. So we would like to rent 4,000 units, but we can't rent 4,000 units because they're not available. Okay, so at $700, only 2,000 apartments are available to rent. So those apartments are going to go to people who are willing and able to pay more for those apartments, possibly. Okay, so 2,000 apartments are rented. What happens to consumer surplus and producer surplus once we impose this, this rent ceiling, and what is the dead weight loss? Remember that dead weight loss means that there are landlords who can't rent properties because the rental rate is too low and they can't cover their cost, and there are people out there who would be willing to pay a little bit more than the $700, but they can't find it. So let's find the value of that. So our consumer surplus is going to drop dramatically. It's no longer going to be this big rectangle. It's going to be this, this smaller triangle. I said rectangle, I meant triangle. Okay, so how do we find this? Again, there's a reduction in consumer surplus or extra value. So again, 1/2 base times height. The base of our triangle is now 2,000. The height of our triangle is 1,200 minus 900. And divide this by 2. Okay, so this is going to be 2,000 times 300 divided by 2. So that's going to be 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Divide that by 2. Now our consumer surplus is going to be 300,000, okay? Compare that to previously when the consumer surplus was 600,000. So the price ceiling is reducing the value that overall consumers would normally get. So let's put over here for our notes, consumer surplus equals 300,000 with ceiling. And so the change has been a drop of consumer surplus of 6,000 minus 300,000. That's a reduction of $300,000 in value that you, the consumer, you, the apartment renter, would normally get. Okay. The next question asks you, well, what happens to producer surplus? What happens to the value that producers get? So we're going to solve this the same way. At 2,000 apartments being rented at $700, this triangle here, this smaller triangle right here, now becomes producer surplus. Okay. So let me just color these in so that we don't forget. This is consumer surplus, and this is our new producer surplus. So let's solve for our new producer surplus. Same formula. The base of this triangle is 2,000. Okay. The height is 700 minus 600. Okay, so 700 minus 600. And so that's going to give us 100 times 2,000. And we're going to divide that by 2. That's the 1/2. In case that's a question for you, that's dividing by 2 is the 1/2. Okay, so 2,000 times 100 is 2, 3, and we put 2 more zeros there, divide that by 2. Producer surplus has shrunk dramatically. It is now only $100,000. Okay, so producers, because of this new rent ceiling, aren't getting the value that they were before. Okay, so let's put producer surplus equals $100,000 with ceiling. Okay. This is a total reduction in market value. So again, this is why this is inefficient. Okay. Now, what happens, what is dead weight loss? Okay, it's back here, ceiling. Well, we know that dead weight loss is the little triangle, okay, this little triangle here. And again, what does it represent? It means that these are the apartments that can't be rented at this lower cost. And this represents people who are willing to pay more but can't find apartments, okay? So what is the value of this dead weight loss? Well, this shape is a triangle, right? So we're going to use the formula again. And this is where your math comes in. Maybe you sat in geometry and said, wow, I'm probably very rarely going to calculate the area of a triangle. You know, maybe I would do it, but maybe not. Well, now this is where you would do it. Now, where would you do this in real life? Well, you would do this if you had to, perhaps if you were a lawyer, had to argue a strategy either for or against price ceilings, if you were trying to explain the inefficiencies created by a price ceiling and how it doesn't achieve equilibrium. There's all sorts of uses for this. Okay, so 1/2 base times height. Okay, so our base, so watch this, this gets a little bit tricky if you're not used to doing this. Our base is going to be from here to here. Okay, so from 3,000 to 3,000 minus 2,000 becomes our base. And our height is 900 minus 700, okay? 900 minus 700. So that's 200, and that's 1,000. And I'm going to multiply this through, so 1,000, 200, and I'm going to divide all that by 2. So that's 1, so it's going to be 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, remember that when you're multiplying, you can just do 1 times 2 gives you 2, and then you just add the number of zeros and add it on, so you don't have to be punching so much in your calculator, at least when the numbers are simple like this. Divided by 2, that means our dead weight loss is equal to $100,000, okay? So that's lost. Money that could have been made, value that could have been achieved, it's lost with the price ceiling. Is the housing market efficient? Well, no. Efficiency occurs where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, as we've discussed before. This is our efficient point. It's inefficient because there are resources being lost. How high could the black market rent be? Well, let's take a look. There are some people way over here who are willing and able to pay a lot of money, okay? Conceivably, that first person in the market might be willing to pay close to $1,200. Okay, so that's how high the black market rent could be. Next question, are ceilings fair? Okay, so question of fairness. Ceilings, especially with respect to rent, with respect to food, are designed with the intent to be fair. Okay, but as you can see, ceilings block the voluntary exchange of private resources. So remember we talked about the principle of private property and being able to use your property the way you see fit, to be able to sell your property at the price that you want to sell it at, for somebody else to choose to buy it at that price or not. So the first thing a ceiling does is it blocks that volunteer exchange. So in that sense, it's not fair, and it really is not part of the free market philosophy. Secondly, are they fair? Well, they're fair only if they go to those individuals, only if these apartments go to those individuals for whom the the $700 a month rent is designed for, okay? So if those people over here, right, get the apartments because that's all they can pay, then it's fair. However, our economy works kind of on a first come, first serve, right? So very conceivably, people who will be willing and able to pay more for an apartment are getting these apartments at a much lower rate, and they have extra consumer surplus. So in that sense, price ceilings do not create fairness. They block the exchange of goods and services and private property by individuals. And they generally create market inefficiencies. So I hope this helped. I am going to go through the case with a price floor so we can see what happens in that regard as well.